Feudal societies were structured around a strict hierarchy where the king or lord stood at the top, followed by nobles, vassals, and peasants. The concept of justice in these societies was heavily tied to maintaining the social order and reinforcing the authority of the ruling classes. Torture was used extensively to extract confessions from those accused of crimes, particularly rebellion or treason. The lords had the right to impose punishments on their serfs, and the king had the power to sentence individuals to death or exile. The use of physical violence was a key tool for keeping the lower classes in check and reminding them of their subjugation. Whipping was a common punishment for those who dared to challenge the authority of the lord or break the laws of the land. The church played a significant role in shaping the justice system of the time. Many feudal laws were heavily influenced by Christian teachings, and punishment was often seen as a means of spiritual purification. Those who committed sins or crimes were believed to be subject to the wrath of God, and earthly punishments were seen as a way to atone for these wrongs. Death sentences were often swift and public, and the execution itself was seen as an act of justice that affirmed the ruler's power. The lords and kings were the supreme authority, and their control over the lower classes was essential for the stability of the system. Punishments in feudal societies were designed to remind the peasants, vassals, and even nobility of their subservient roles in the feudal pyramid. Public execution was a spectacle that reminded the population of the power and control held by those at the top of the feudal system. Those who were found guilty of treason or rebellion could have their land and titles stripped away. The use of torture was sanctioned by both the state and the church, especially in cases involving witchcraft or heresy. Victims of torture were subjected to flaying, burning, and even stretching on the rack, where their limbs would be torn from their body. The goal of these punishments was not just to punish, but to break the spirit of the offender, forcing them to admit to crimes or beliefs that they might not have committed. Those suspected of crimes like theft or witchcraft were subjected to grueling physical trials, such as walking on hot coals or plunging their hands into boiling water. The fear of punishment kept the lower classes in line, but it was the rewards of loyalty, land, titles, and wealth that kept the nobility from challenging the power of the monarch. Punishment was the tool used to maintain order, while rewards were the means by which the power structure was solidified. Together, they ensured that the feudal system would continue to dominate Europe for centuries. If they survived without injury, they were deemed innocent. If they were harmed, they were presumed guilty. This method of trial was deeply tied to the belief in divine justice, and the outcome was often seen as proof of the individual's relationship with God. Although trial by ordeal was eventually phased out in favor of more rational methods, it still reflected the feudal mindset of relying on divine will to decide matters of justice. This form of punishment not only hurt the individual financially, but also stripped them of their social standing, as land and titles were the primary sources of power in the feudal system. By taking away their wealth and influence, the king ensured that they could not challenge the monarch's authority. However, the fear of punishment remained an integral part of the social order. While punishments in later centuries became more refined and less brutal, the legacy of feudal justice continues to influence how we think about crime, punishment, and social control in modern societies. Excommunication from the church was also a powerful punishment used to control individuals, as being cut off from the community of believers was seen as a fate worse than death. For peasants, being thrown into a dungeon or prison was a fate worse than death, as the conditions in medieval prisons were brutal. Hanging was the most common form of capital punishment, especially for peasants or lower-class criminals. The Catholic Church, which held immense power during the medieval period, believed that the authority of the monarch was divinely ordained. As a result, punishments like excommunication or execution were seen as part of God's will. The church often collaborated with secular authorities to punish those who defied religious doctrines or challenged the divine order. For example, those accused of witchcraft or heresy were often burned alive at the stake, a punishment seen as both spiritual purification and a way to protect society from perceived evil. The punishment was carried out in public squares, where the criminal's body would be left hanging as a reminder to others of the consequences of defying the law. In some cases, the body would be displayed for days, allowing the public to see the consequences of disobedience. The brutality of public executions reinforced the fear of the lords and kings, reminding everyone that their position in the social order was absolute. Rats, disease, and starvation were rampant, and imprisonment often led to death from neglect rather than any formal execution. However, for the nobility, imprisonment could be a political tool used by the ruling class to remove rivals without executing them. The fear of physical punishment kept many peasants in line, and the system of punishments ensured that those at the bottom of the social pyramid remained subservient to their superiors. Crimes like insubordination, trespassing, or even gossip could result in severe punishment. Flogging was one of the most common forms of punishment for these offenses. A serf could be whipped in front of the village as a public spectacle, reinforcing the subjugation to their lord's authority. The act of public flogging served not only to punish the individual, but also to set an example for the entire community, ensuring that others would be deterred from breaking the law. Lords and kings had the power to exact vengeance on those who wronged them, often in brutal and unforgiving ways. Blood feuds between families or noble houses were common, and the law often allowed for a tit-for-tat approach to justice. This system of justice, though seemingly righteous, often led to cycles of violence and retribution that would last for generations. Punishment, therefore, was not just about disciplining individuals. It was about maintaining the social order and ensuring the subjugation of the lower classes. The castle dungeons were infamous for their squalid conditions, where nobles who had fallen out of favor could be locked away. However, for peasants, imprisonment was not always an option, and punishment was often executed more immediately, such as through flogging, branding, or public executions. The use of imprisonment for the lower classes was often seen as impractical, as it was believed that they would simply be replaced by another serf. Punishments played a crucial role in upholding this hierarchy, as they were designed not just to punish, but to remind individuals of their place within the social structure. In many cases, the criminals were executed in public squares or town centers, where crowds gathered to watch the spectacle. Beheading, hanging, and burning were some of the more common forms of execution used to punish those who threatened the social order. These events were meant to serve as both punishment and a warning to the public. The visibility of these punishments reinforced the idea that disobedience to the lord or the king would result in a gruesome and public end. In the early feudal period, punishments were often harsh and public, serving as both a deterrent and a way to demonstrate the absolute power of the rulers. Shaming individuals publicly was used to reinforce social hierarchies and diminish the status of the offender. For example, stocks and pillories were used to publicly display criminals who had committed petty crimes like theft or insulting authority. Those subjected to these humiliating punishments were often pelted with rotten food, mud, or stones, creating an intense social stigma that lasted long after the punishment had ended. Public executions were a central aspect of feudal justice. Punishments were not just limited to physical violence. Humiliation was also a powerful tool of control. In feudal societies, serfs and peasants were considered the property of the landlords, and their punishment was often swift and severe. The role of punishment in feudal societies was also influenced by religion. Feudal punishment was also tied to the concept of revenge. In addition to physical punishments, imprisonment was also used, though it was less common for peasants than for nobility. The most feared punishment for those in feudal societies was death, which could be meted out for a variety of offenses, including treason, murder, or even disrespecting a noble. In the hierarchical society of feudal Europe, punishments were not only a means of maintaining order, but also a method of reinforcing power and control. The hierarchical nature of feudal society meant that the peasants, or serfs, were often subjected to the harshest punishments for the most trivial of offenses. Imprisonment was another form of punishment used in feudal society, but it was often reserved for more serious crimes or those who posed a direct threat to the social order. The crown also used confiscation of property as a punishment for the nobility. Torture was another method employed by the feudal authorities to extract confessions or punish those who were perceived as threats to the order. One of the most horrifying punishments in the feudal system was execution. The role of the church in feudal society further emphasized the moral and religious justification for punishment. Another form of punishment was the trial by ordeal, which was based on the belief that divine intervention would determine the guilt or innocence of the accused. The feudal system relied on punishments to control the masses, but it also depended on the loyalty and obedience of the nobles. As the feudal system began to give way to more centralized monarchies, the role of punishment shifted from local lords to centralized courts and governments.